So, in my previous video, I talked a bit on the MBTI value function when it's externalized, FE. In this one, I will talk a bit more on the introverted side of that. So, the approach extrovert feelers take in establishing their values was to construct their likes and their dislikes and their principles, very much brick by brick. With introverted feelers, the game changes a bit. Because of this, the main personal conflict of an IFP is not in building themselves to align with anything, it's to discover themselves, quite organically, and then defending whatever they happen to find that way. So I will be using mainly the IFPs as examples for this, the INFP and the ISFP, just because they have their function in question as their primary. So basically just like I did in my last video. A typical behavior of introverted feeling is that it does tend to view itself and its own comforts as pretty immutable. As in, they will not sever parts of themselves or aspects to accommodate a situation. Or at least they won't do it as willingly as the FE types. And if you make them do it, they're quite liable to get pissed off. So there's that. So this would be the opposite of an EFJ. And the reason for this is, I think, because an FE user isn't as compelled to act out what they want by an inner need. They don't have that. They're very much a blank slate inside. As much as it doesn't seem that way, because they're also bubbly and joyful and empathetic. But they're not. They're just blank sheets of paper compared to an FI user. No. So they've no problem that aside in service of something external is what I mean. Their needs. This is why EJs make such effective leaders, is because they're able to lose sight of themselves, which is necessary if they want to move forward in the world. But IPs, and mainly IFPs, are not great at this, because to them, losing sight of themselves doesn't really exist, because their own selves is the only thing that exists for them. It's all they see. So they can't lose sight of it. And I don't mean that in a selfish or conceited way either. And this is where FI becomes a bit hard to explain, because you see, with every IFP, it's different. Everyone thinks introverted intuition is the hardest to describe. It's not. It's introverted feeling. Because introverted feeling has no particulars that you can point to as examples of behaviors of that one function. It's just impossible, because the particulars are different for every individual, for every case that you could cite. It's a very individual function. It's all subjective, completely arbitrary. And so it doesn't hold any consistency. So the only way to talk about it is through theories and generalities. But anyway, the thing that FI judges by, because it's a judging function, so it discriminates. The thing that it judges by is an inner need of comfort, I've noticed, I think. At least INFPs seem to value comfort pretty high, and I don't think it's any different for ISFPs. So let's call that a compass. It's a compass whose true north is always maximum self-comfort. So for now, every IFP with a developed sense of identity has a natural sense of the things that they're okay with and the things that they're not okay with. I know it's ridiculous to put it that way, but literally that's as far down as I can simplify it to. So with an INFP or an ISFP, the outside world is like a torrent of water that's like constantly trying to influence them in some way. Their job, as far as they're concerned, is to remain as grounded as possible in order to stay in one place and not let the water sway them at all. Grounded as an individual, let me put it that way. It's like an internal core, an internal fire that even the tsunami around them can put out. And for this, they try to exercise TE honesty by not lying in their actions or their words, by developing themselves to the point where they don't do things or say things that's incongruent with themselves. They can push back against this outside influence, in a sense individuating themselves. But they need to do this through extroverted thinking, which is quite weak in the beginning. So yeah, up until the point an INFP has needed needed like a bread dough, needed themselves through grit and discipline, and into an unyielding, focused, stoic individual, they do have a tendency to appear childish and bratty, because without that development they get led astray by their extroverted auxiliary functions, which are always putting new shiny things in their path and saying, oh no, follow this, or follow this, and in order to justify to themselves, more so to themselves than to anyone else, going after that thing, they need to rationalize within themselves, well, well, my principles that are stopping me from going after it aren't really worth that much anyway. So then that turns into hypocrisy, if you get what I mean. But yeah, that's an unhealthy IFP. That's absolutely not the way the introverted feelers need to be. And the reason they make that impression on most people isn't purely because of their subjectivity either. So you see, the thing with FI is that it is purely a subjective function. It's not fact. It's not rational. It has no bearing on the real world. Okay, and so it is up to the individual to validate it for themselves and to everybody else around them. A lot of FI users forget that. They tend to demonize the outside. They tend to have the man that's always constantly on their back about something or calling them out for whatever reason. But it is up to, because FI is so individual, it is up to the person using it to prove to everyone else that they have a reason to acknowledge it, if you get what I mean. It's kind of like the John Wick movie. Now that I think about it, I mean, if you think about the plot of that movie, what is it about? It's about a crime boss having his empire go up in flames and losing everything, all because his stupid kid made a stupid mistake to the wrong person. Right? Okay, so there's John Wick, and he gets his car stolen and his dog killed, which is, don't get me wrong, it's a terrible crime. But compared to the many other things that this family has done to other people, it's really not that severe. But nevertheless, because it was crossing the line for John had his principles and values encroached on, he still wreaked revenge on the whole family. And, he just disappeared like that. Left a trail of blaze and dust behind him because of. So that, you see, that is what every IFP should aspire to turn into. It's John Wick. I'm pretty sure John Wick is an ISFP, by the way. I think it's a pretty easy guess. You could kind of guess without even looking that up. But yeah, you see, there is an ISFP with an incredible sense of identity and discipline, all achieved through his extroverted thinking. And it doesn't matter that the kid that did all this to him didn't know anything about John's past or how it was spitting on his values. It doesn't matter. The fact is that he did commit the crime that he did commit against him, and so the movie happens to him. Yeah. I went on a weird tangent there. So yeah, John Wick is like the personal character arc of like every FI user. I think that is the personal narrative of every FI user. It's like the archetype. This seems to be more of a hang up for the FI users whose more dominant pairing is with their auxiliary and not their tertiary. And there is a difference, which I will get to explaining in a minute. So what I have just described is the struggle for FI to hold to itself as a person. Despite themselves as a person not having any value to anyone else besides themselves, they still stick to it and still hold themselves to it. But you get what I mean when I say that, right? It's not logic. It's not something that you could prove to other people. It's not even rationale. It's just personal. But it has value to them. And because it has value to them, others have to recognize. So do you get me? That's the FI as a value function has declared to the self, or yeah, to the self, that whatever I am is the most important. So defend that at all costs. Do you get me? That's kind of like the general MO of the function. It's incapable of thinking any other way. Well, okay, I say to you, if you do believe that whatever you are is the most important, then you should hold yourself to it as if it were your truth, as if it were real to you as the air you breathe. But see, that's the problem with unhealthy FI users, is that they don't see it that way. They don't recognize that if they do want to be taken seriously in the real world and exercise effectiveness with their extroverted thinking, then they do need to treat their own truth as if it were as real as the air they breathed. Do you get what I mean? Yeah, think I think that's what I wanted to say about that. Yeah. So yeah, because not everybody is like that. Not that I think that is a uniquely an FI thing to do, to prioritize the individual, because every other type slips on their principles all the time, especially the FI trickster types, namely the ESTP and the ENTP. A trickster, the trickster function. In case you didn't know that, it's the shadow of your third function. So if that happens to be FI, then yeah, you play it pretty fast and loose, my friend. But an INFP or an ISFP, never. So the main way they go about this process, about manifesting their identity, I just took like a sort of a 180 there, describing on how the IFP manages to form their identity in the first place to begin with. But yeah, that's what I'm talking about now. So the way they manage to do that in the first few decades of their life is by using their auxiliaries, which are extroverted. Again, I'm going to draw a parallel between them and an FE user. Because an extrovert feeler needs the ideas that it picks up from the outside to form some sort of overall coherence and harmony within themselves, like when they assemble it all together, because they're all separate pieces that they just collect from here and there. It is up to them to, assemble that into something that makes sense, and they do this through using usually NI or TI, one of those two, and it's because those two functions are especially good at building holistic systems, so they're conducive to that. But introverted feelings don't need to have this problem, you see, because they don't need to establish any sort of coherence or harmony with anything except for maybe what's already internal, what they've already gathered in and solidified within themselves. But apart from that, they can be as eclectic as they want to be. So, yeah. They also live out their dominant FI through these auxiliaries. Extroverted sensing in the case of the ISFP, and extroverted intuition in the case of the INFP. The more exploration this type does via their extroverted perceptions, the richer their identity gets. The problem with this type starts to arise when their identity gets sufficiently large enough and idiosyncratic enough, which usually happens around late teens, hence all of the youth rebellion, to when it isn't immediately obvious how their likes and their dislikes and their values ought to be structured and ought to be fitted together and ought to be treated. Because you see, in order to do any of those things, you first have to classify things yourself, essentially, first. And FI dominants kind of have it rubs them the wrong way, the idea of classification. It makes them think of the man, the big bad system, And the way FI behaves in response to this can often be thought of as quite childish, because the way FI sees this as the man is encroaching on them, but they fail to realize that the reason everybody else, the whole world, seems to be against them is because the FI user hasn't proven to everybody why they themselves should be acknowledged, why their own identity needs to be taken into consideration and accommodated to. It sounds like a kind of cruel when I put it like that. Like the FI kind of has no power in the world unless they prove themselves in somehow. But like, listen, every personality type has their own struggles. It just so happens that the FI user's struggle happens to be that they have to prove themselves constantly. But yeah, if a person fails to do that, then they become unhealthy and they manifest the typical bratty, selfish, conceited behaviors that we see everywhere online. Okay, because everybody online, every online INFP seems to go around like like she's Tinkerbell, but that's not what being an IFP is. Being an IFP is about being a stoic and a sort of weird self-disciplinarian. So yeah, the way introverted feeling behaves is much the same as the way TI behaves, actually. It wants to understand. It wants to understand in much the same way. But introverted feeling wants to understand its experiences through the lens of one's own personal internal processes, emotions, values, limits, and boundaries. And I'm fairly certain the way in which introverted feeling chooses what to accept and what to reject is based on how much that thing that they're evaluating scores on their personal comfort scale. Like I said, that comfort, that sense of comfort is like the magnetic force that guides their internal compass that I was going on about earlier. IFPs are big on comfort. I noticed that. Their tastes are more particular than other types. And just the way TI chooses all things very meticulously and always according to some specific parameter, FI I think works very similarly. So it's not all arbitrary, but the problem comes that I can't actually understand it. Me being separate from the FI user, I can't see that system that they're employing to judge all the things that they're judging. Whereas with a TI user, it's relatively simple because it's just logic, and like everybody gets logic, so it's easily communicable, which is why they have inferior FE, because they fail to. Okay, I'm getting off topic again. So the way they determine the things they like and the things they don't like is by maximally keeping everything around their environment at a baseline of 0, which is comfort. Okay. So in order for an FI user to evaluate anything that's incoming, they need to keep their environment and themselves at a 0 all the time, and that 0 being like maximum comfort, or at least very close, so that nothing else is interfering with that like barometer, that pleasure barometer. If if you get what I mean. So, FI being paired with TE is naturally a function that discriminates. It is the opposite of FE. The most primal psychological conflict of its users will be to defend itself from outside forces that work to invalidate it. The maturity of the person will determine how much hostility this defending is done with, but in any case, it is always, I've noticed, that while FE is more sensitive to exclusion, FI is more sensitive to comments or critiques that threaten invalidation or inadequacy. Both count, by the way, invalidation and inadequacy. This is where the image of the lone wolf comes from with these types. They very much like the idea of an inner fire that they kindle and that keeps them going, and that nothing external has the right to extinguish within them. But the problem with these types lies is that they need to prove the legitimacy of their explored identity, of their explored person to themselves, and they do this through TE. So yeah, I can't hammer that home point enough, guys. Once they've sufficiently explored themselves by having their perceiving function, SC/NE, feed them data, and have FI judge on them, their next job is to use extroverted thinking to solidify them by eliminating perceived threats, right? just like EFJs are prone to a herd mentality. IFPs have a problem with the persecution complex. They think everybody is against them all the time, and because T is quite clumsy, and it isn't their main approach to life, they have a tendency to play martyrs in arguments a lot. So they have to be careful with that. These types have an ultimate hatred for people who ignorantly assume that they know them and start critiquing them based on false premises. Yeah, so this video is already a bit out of order, but in the beginning I started out talking about FI as it relates to any, which is the more turbulent side. Now I think I'll move on to FI and SI, which is the more assertive side of the type. I'm pretty sure, as bullshit as 16 personalities is, I think it got that one thing right. I think every type does have a turbulent and an assertive side. And that happens because there's two approaches to every type. There's the dominant and the auxiliary pairing. So if a person prefers expressing themselves or living out through those two functions, or the dominant and the tertiary and living out through those two functions. So yeah, I think they got that one thing right, even if the quiz is bullshit. So see, this is quite an interesting dynamic, because there's the FI and the SI. I think it's a quite interesting dynamic in my opinion, because it's actually quite rare. Most IFPs I've met are fascinated with their auxiliaries, and that's fair, considering most types don't like to think of themselves as simple creatures, right? It's sort of an insult to say that someone is simple, and nobody would take that comment more to heart than an IFP, let me tell you. And then in order to combat this, the way they do that, to make themselves more nuanced, is they try to perceive or experience or take in as much as they can, hopping from place to place, from interest to interest, gathering in data. That's all their perception function's doing. It's perceiving, just gathering all the time, all day, every day, for their FI to evaluate and judge. And then for their TE inferior to integrate and make it stay, make a lasting impression on their psyche, so to speak. So the good thing with these types is, with the FISI, using FISI. Hold on. I just realized that I was talking about exclusively about the INFPs there, but it also counts for ISFPs, so the FI and I. So the good thing with the dominant tertiary axis types is that they're more smart with their TE. Extroverted thinking comes more naturally for them, for obvious reasons. It's because they don't get seduced by the new, like the way the auxiliary heavy types do. They just focus on the foundation that they've already laid down. And so they just keep on fortifying that and fortifying that and fortifying that instead of moving on to something new and adding to it. So the problem comes when these types wake up one day and realize that they are extremely narrow. Narrow in their experiences, narrow in their capabilities, and this, in a weird way, actually undermines their TE development that they would have otherwise had. Because if you're narrow in your capabilities and you're narrow in your experiences of the world, then how effective can you really be in it? Do you get what I mean? Even if you are very effective at applying TE to yourself as a person, as an individual, you're very stoic, but you're just ineffective. You don't really know how to impress upon your environment because you just don't know enough. You haven't really experienced enough. Everything's an unfamiliar territory for you. So that's why personal growth for those types doesn't come in inferior development. I mean, it does, because every type sort of really needs to focus on their inferior, because it's truly is very pathetically underdeveloped for most types. But for the dominant tertiary using types, maybe a bit more focus on the extroverted auxiliaries will help you to become a more fuller, better person. Because at the end of the day, you have to extrovert yourself somehow. You can't just sit in your room and live in your head. Because you exist in an external world. You can't just act as if all there was to you was up here, because it's not. But yeah, just to close out this video, what it comes down to for both of these types, right? What the name of the game is control. Both both manifestations of inferior TE is obsessed with control, except one is hung up on being controlled and the other is hung up on controlling, specifically controlling themselves, self-control. Yeah, and they need to make peace with that somehow. They need to find a way to make it work, and I just explained the 2 ways that they can do that. So yeah, my next video will probably be on one of the thinking judging functions as well. I was thinking that I would run through all of the judging functions, and since I've already done both of the feeling ones, I will probably move on to the thinking ones next. And personally, I always found the judging functions a bit more interesting than the perceiving ones, because literally all the perceiving ones is just a floodgate. They're floodgate functions. Whereas the judging functions are like a sieve. But anyway, yeah. So my next one will either be the TI or the TE. I haven't really decided on any specific one yet, but probably TE. In keeping with the fact that this video is introverted, I should probably make my next video on an extroverted function. So, yeah.